The humid, stuffy atmosphere of the small chapel in Sinaloa contrasted with the reverent silence that hung in the air. On one of the wooden benches worn by time sat a young American missionary from Chicago, Robert Prevost, leafing through pages of his Bible while trying to cope with the Mexican heat. The tropical rain pounded heavily on the roof, creating a melody that amplified the sense of isolation in that remote village. At 28, Robert dedicated his life to the Order of St. Augustine, serving in the poorest areas of Mexico, far from the comfort and opportunities that his academic background could have afforded him in the United States. On the same afternoon, a young Filipino boxer of only 16 entered the chapel, soaked by the storm falling outside. Manny Pacquiao had crossed the ocean to participate in a small amateur boxing competition in the region, representing the Philippines in a desperate attempt to earn some money to send to his needy family. The tournament had been cancelled due to heavy rains, and now the young fighter, alone in a foreign country, sought shelter and spiritual comfort while trying to cope with the disappointment and hunger that had gripped his stomach for 2 days. The gazes of the two men crossed for a brief moment, an American priest and a Filipino boxer, separated by culture, language, and purpose, but united by a strange destiny in that small Mexican chapel. Young Manny, in simple clothes and torn shoes, remained near the door, as if he didn't feel worthy of advancing further into the sacred space. In his pocket, just a few coins insufficient for a decent meal, and in his heart, the responsibility for an entire family that depended on his boxing gloves for survival. Robert noticed the young man's discomfort, how he was soaked to the bone, and how his eyes reflected not just physical fatigue, but a soul exhaustion that the priest knew well, having witnessed the same look on so many faces in the poor communities he served. In an impulse of compassion, the young missionary took from his bag the snack he had saved for himself, a simple sandwich and a bottle of water, and walked toward the visitor, offering the food without asking questions, without expecting gratitude, just responding to the human call in the face of evident need. The rain continued to fall for hours, and the two remained in the chapel in silence, each in their thoughts, exchanging no more than a few basic words limited by the language barrier. When the storm finally subsided, the young boxer thanked him with a nod and went out into the night, disappearing into the muddy streets of Sinaloa. Father Robert would never have imagined that that brief encounter, that small gesture of offering a sandwich to a hungry stranger, would be etched in the young fighter's memory as a moment of dignity amid his path of trials. The years passed swiftly after that fleeting encounter in the Mexican chapel. Robert Prevost ascended in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, always maintaining his commitment to the most vulnerable. From a missionary in Sinaloa, he became a bishop in Peru, where he lived for decades serving the most remote Andean communities. His dedication to the poor and his administrative ability did not go unnoticed by the Vatican. Over time, he was called to Rome to assume increasingly important positions, becoming a cardinal and, in a surprising twist for an American, being chosen as the new pope under the name of Leo XIV, the first pontiff from the United States in the millennial history of the Catholic Church. In parallel, Manny Pacquiao's path had transformed into a story of overcoming that transcended sports. From the impoverished streets of General Santos City in the Philippines, he conquered the boxing world with a unique combination of speed, power, and unwavering determination. His meteoric trajectory led him to win world titles in 8 different weight categories, an unprecedented feat in boxing history. More than an athlete, Pacquiao became a national symbol, a senator in his country, and a philanthropist who never forgot his humble origins. Now, at 46, Manny was facing what many considered his greatest challenge, a return to the ring after 4 years of retirement to compete for the WBC welterweight world title against Mario Barrios, an opponent 20 years younger. The fight was scheduled for July 2025 in Las Vegas. Critics called this attempt irresponsible, a vain pursuit of glory that could tarnish his legacy or, worse, permanently damage his health. Betting houses considered him an underdog for the first time in many years, and even his most ardent fans feared the outcome of this final chapter in his career. Preparation for the fight had begun intensely. Manny trained as if he were half his age, waking up at 4 in the morning to run, spending exhausting hours in the gym, and following a rigorous diet that tested his discipline to the extreme. But behind the physical determination, there was an internal battle. In moments of silence, when the pain in his muscles threatened his resolution, he wondered if he was making the right choice, if this last challenge wasn't just a desperate attempt to prove something he had already demonstrated so many times throughout his career. Amid this anguish, just 4 months before the fight scheduled for Las Vegas, Manny received correspondence with the official seal of the Vatican. The envelope contained a handwritten letter, signed by Pope Leo XIV, inviting the boxer for a private meeting during the pastoral visit that the pontiff would make to the United States in the coming weeks. The letter did not explain the reason for the invitation, only mentioned a desire for a few minutes with the Filipino champion. What intrigued Manny was not just the invitation itself, but the inexplicable sense of familiarity that the Pope's handwriting conveyed to him, as if somehow their paths had already crossed in distant times. The Las Vegas sky displayed a spectacular sunset, tinting the horizon with orange tones that contrasted with the city's bright signs. In the hotel room where he was staying during part of his preparation for the July fight, Manny Pacquiao found himself alone, contemplating the urban landscape through the window while his fingers repeatedly passed over the second letter he had just received. The document, brought by a special Vatican emissary, was not just a confirmation of the meeting as he had initially imagined, but an extensive personal letter from Pope Leo XIV, revealing a connection between the two men that had been buried in the sands of time. The pontiff's words described with impressive accuracy the encounter from decades ago in the small chapel in Sinaloa, the young American missionary and the hungry Filipino boxer during a tropical storm. The letter detailed how Father Robert, now Pope Leo XIV, had never forgotten the determined face of that young athlete, and how he had been amazed years later to recognize that same expression on the face of the world champion that Manny had become. The Pope confessed that he had never been absolutely certain they were the same person until recently, when he watched an interview in which Pacquiao mentioned his first trip to Mexico for a cancelled amateur tournament, and how a foreign priest had offered him food in a chapel during a storm. Manny's eyes filled with tears as he read how that brief encounter had impacted the pontiff's life. In the letter, Pope Leo XIV explained that the example of humility, determination, and faith of the young boxer, even in his most vulnerable moments, had served as constant inspiration during his own spiritual journey. He related that, in moments of doubt about his calling to serve in difficult places, he frequently remembered the young fighter who, even with nothing, maintained his dignity and hope intact. The words in the letter conveyed how that example had fueled the then priest's determination when the burden seemed too heavy. In the most touching part of the letter, the pontiff revealed that he had followed Pacquiao's career from a distance all these years, not as a boxing fan, but as someone who saw in the champion's trajectory a testimony to human potential when fueled by faith and responsibility toward others. He praised not only the sporting achievements but mainly the boxer's social works, his dedication to family, and how, even achieving fame and fortune, Manny had never abandoned his characteristic humility and commitment to the less fortunate in the Philippines. The letter ended with words of encouragement for the challenge that Pacquiao would face in July. The Pope did not opine whether the decision to return to the ring was right or not, but affirmed his confidence in Manny's ability to face this chapter with the same dignity he had demonstrated throughout his life. The pontiff's message emphasized that the outcome of the fight was less important than the integrity with which he faced it. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, where the Pope would like to return, after so many years, the favor, offering breakfast to the man who, as a hungry young man, had taught him so much about inner strength. A week after receiving the revealing letter, Manny Pacquiao headed to a small Catholic chapel on the outskirts of Las Vegas. The location had been strategically chosen for the meeting, away from the eyes of the press and public, with discreet security ensuring the privacy of the historic moment. The boxer arrived wearing simple clothes, dark pants and a white shirt buttoned to the neck, that contrasted with his public image as a global celebrity. Upon entering the sacred space, a wave of familiarity enveloped him, as if time had folded upon itself, recreating the atmosphere of that Mexican chapel where, decades earlier, a young priest had offered him food in his moment of greatest need. Inside the chapel, Pope Leo XIV waited without the pomp and protocol that normally surrounded his public appearances. When the gazes of the two men crossed, time seemed to suspend for a moment. The pontiff, at 69, displayed on his face the marks of a life dedicated to service in often adverse conditions, while the boxer, at 46, carried in his expression the subtle scars of countless battles in the ring. There was an enormous distance between their lives, ecclesiastical life and the career of a professional fighter, and yet, there they were, united by a brief moment from the past that had left indelible marks on both. The meeting began with formalities that quickly dissolved into a surprisingly natural and fluid conversation. At a simple table, they shared a modest breakfast, bread, fruits, and coffee, a humble meal that carried deep symbolism, echoing the sandwich shared decades ago. The Pope spoke about his journey from Mexico to Peru, and finally to the Vatican, highlighting how his experience with the poorest communities in Latin America had shaped his vision of the Church and the world. Manny, in turn, opened his heart about the challenges of his own journey. Not just the fights in the ring, but the internal battles against the temptations of fame and wealth, the doubts about his abilities now that age was advancing, and the constant pressure of carrying the hopes of an entire nation on his shoulders. During the conversation, the Pope surprised Pacquiao by revealing that he had brought with him a small object kept for all these years, a simple rosary made of worn wooden beads that he had planned to give to the young boxer on that distant day in the Mexican chapel, but hadn't had the opportunity before Manny left. With emotion in his voice, the pontiff explained how that rosary had accompanied him on missions around the world, blessing his path in moments of doubt. Now, finally, the object could fulfill its original destiny. Upon accepting the gift, Manny felt the symbolic weight of that simple object, not just a religious item, but a tangible testimony of the connection that transcended time and circumstances, uniting two souls who had briefly crossed paths in a moment of genuine need and sincere compassion. When the time came to say goodbye, something in the environment had subtly changed. They were no longer the Pope and the world boxing champion, public figures with monumental responsibilities, but simply two men who shared a deep understanding of the weight of expectation, the value of humility, and the impact that small acts of kindness can have throughout a life. Before leaving, the Pope asked permission to bless Manny, not to ensure his victory in the July fight, he explained, but so that he would find peace and clarity regardless of the outcome. Kneeling before the pontiff, the Filipino fighter, who had faced the greatest champions in the world without showing fear, let silent tears run down his face as he received the apostolic blessing, aware that this moment, invisible to the outside world, would mark a turning point in his extraordinary journey. The months between the meeting with the Pope and the fight scheduled for July witnessed a remarkable transformation in Manny Pacquiao. What began as a subtle change in his approach to training evolved into something that even the most skeptical observers in the boxing world could not ignore. The usual media pressure intensified as the date approached. Interviews, photo sessions, promotional appearances multiplied each week, but the Filipinos' behavior radically deviated from the pattern established in the sport. Instead of the traditional provocations and grandiose promises that normally precede great confrontations, Manny answered questions with a disconcerting tranquility, speaking about gratitude for the opportunity to compete again and expressing genuine respect for his young opponent. Freddie Roach, the legendary trainer who had accompanied Pacquiao for more than 2 decades, observed this change with a mixture of fascination and admiration. During a particularly intense sparring session, when Manny demonstrated reflexes and speed impressive for a man of 46, Roach questioned him about the source of this renewed physical and mental disposition. The boxer smiled and mentioned only that he had received a special blessing, without elaborating details of the meeting with the pontiff. The wooden rosary given by the Pope now accompanied Pacquiao at all times, discreetly kept in his pocket during training and carefully placed under his pillow at night, a tangible link connecting the present to the humble origins of his extraordinary journey. Mario Barrios, his 26-year-old opponent and current WBC welterweight champion, followed Pacquiao's interviews and public appearances with growing curiosity. Having grown up idolizing the Filipino as a model in boxing, Barrios now found himself in the position of facing a living legend of the sport. not at the peak of his career, as many pointed out, but in a moment of surprising renewal. Sports analysts speculated about what might be behind the almost monastic serenity that Pacquiao demonstrated. Some suggested it was just a psychological strategy to destabilize the younger opponent. Others, who knew the Filipino's history more deeply, suspected that something significant had occurred in his personal life, something that transcended the sport and had realigned his priorities and perspectives. The Pope's letter and the wooden rosary remained as private treasures that Manny consulted regularly during his preparation. They were not superstitious amulets, but constant reminders of how small acts of kindness could reverberate through time, shaping destinies in unpredictable ways. The pontiff's words about the true meaning of victory, not necessarily winning the title, but maintaining integrity in all circumstances, touched a deep point in the fighter's psychology. After a lifetime pursuing tangible achievements, belts, records, public recognition, Pacquiao found himself reflecting on a different kind of legacy, one that could not be measured in statistics or accumulated titles. In a rare interview given to a longtime Filipino journalist, weeks before the fight, Manny spoke enigmatically about how his preparation for this confrontation fundamentally differed from all previous ones. Without revealing details about the meeting with the Pope, he mentioned that he had rediscovered the essential purpose that had initially led him to boxing, not just as a means to escape poverty, but as a way to demonstrate that human dignity could prevail even in the most challenging circumstances. When questioned about his chances against a significantly younger opponent, the 8-time world champion in different categories responded with words that disconcerted both fans and critics. This fight was important not because he could win or lose, but because it represented an opportunity to demonstrate values that transcended the sport, values he had learned when he had nothing but his dignity and faith, and that the true combat was not against his opponent, but against the limitations we impose on ourselves when we forget who we really are. As May gave way to June, and the July fight date rapidly approached, the transformation in Manny Pacquiao's approach to his physical and mental preparation attracted increasing attention from the international media. Sports journalists who had followed the Filipino boxer for decades noticed something profoundly different in his demeanor. There was a serenity in his eyes that contrasted with the fierce intensity that had always characterized his previous campaigns. At a press conference organized by the event promoters, a veteran reporter directly questioned whether something specific had occurred in his personal life that would explain this evident change. With an enigmatic smile, Manny replied only that sometimes it takes finding someone from the past to rediscover the true purpose of the future. The technical preparation for the combat continued at an accelerated pace, with daily sessions of sparring, physical conditioning, and strategic adjustments. Buboy Fernandez, childhood friend and crucial part of Pacquiao's technical team, commented with the other trainers how Manny seemed to find new reserves of energy and determination, even in the most strenuous exercises. On a particularly difficult morning, after a brutal series of sparring rounds, Buboy found the boxer sitting alone in the locker room, silently contemplating the wooden rosary in his hands. When asked about the meaning of that simple object, Manny replied that it was a reminder of how a small act of kindness can sustain an entire lifetime, and that he now understood that perhaps the highest purpose of his career was not to collect belts, but to inspire others to maintain their dignity regardless of circumstances. On the other side of the world, at the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV discreetly followed the news about Pacquiao's preparation. In private conversations with his closest advisors, the pontiff occasionally mentioned his admiration for the Filipino boxer's journey, not just his sporting achievements, but mainly how he had used his platform to help needy communities in his native country. Without revealing the personal connection that united them, the Pope spoke about how Pacquiao represented a powerful example of how humility and generosity could coexist with global success, a theme he frequently incorporated into his homilies and public audiences, though without directly mentioning the boxer. Among the many responsibilities that filled his days as leader of the Catholic Church, the Pope found moments to write letters of encouragement to Pacquiao. These messages, handwritten and sent through private diplomatic channels, did not speak about victory or defeat in the ring, but about the deeper meaning of the fight that both waged in their respective fields, a fight to honor their gifts and serve as instruments of hope for those most in need. Some of these letters contained theological reflections on how human fragility could be transformed into strength when we recognize our fundamental interconnection, while others were simply expressions of friendship and support from one man to another, transcending the vast differences in their positions and public roles. For Manny, these letters became a vital source of guidance during the most challenging moments of his preparation. When physical pain threatened to overwhelm his resolution, or when doubt about his ability to compete with an opponent 2 decades younger insinuated itself into his mind, he turned to the Pope's words to find renewed clarity and purpose. One phrase in particular from one of these letters resonated deeply in his consciousness. True victory is not measured by the applause of the world, but by fidelity to the call we have received, even when this call leads us through paths of difficulty and uncertainty. It is in vulnerability, accepted with dignity, that we find our most authentic strength. These words accompanied each movement of his training, each strategic decision, each moment of preparation for what many considered the final chapter of his legendary career. As the month of May progressed and preparation for the July fight continued, an interesting dynamic began to manifest in the parallel lives of Pope Leo XIV and Manny Pacquiao. Without the public or press knowing, a regular correspondence had been established between the pontiff and the boxer, letters that crossed oceans carrying not just words of encouragement, but deep reflections on the meaning of life, service, and purpose. For the Pope, these communications represented a unique opportunity to maintain a bond with someone who, decades earlier, had inadvertently influenced his spiritual journey with a simple example of dignity in adversity. For Manny, the pontiff's messages offered a perspective that transcended the world of sports, helping him contextualize his career and imminent challenge within a broader framework of human meaning. In one of his latest letters, the Pope shared a reflection that illuminated the deeper meaning of the unlikely connection between them. Perhaps the greatest miracle of life, he wrote, is not the great events or dramatic coincidences, but the way small moments of shared humanity can create invisible waves that propagate through time and space, touching lives in ways we could never anticipate. On that distant day in Sinaloa, we were just 2 young strangers to each other. You, a hungry boxer seeking shelter. I, an inexperienced priest offering what little I had. Neither of us could imagine that decades later we would be where we are today, or that brief encounter would carry so much meaning for our individual journeys. Media coverage intensified as the July fight approached. The traditional press conferences, photo sessions, and television interviews multiplied, with everyone wanting to capture every nuance of both fighters' preparation. For many observers, the age difference between Pacquiao and Barrios was the determining factor of the narrative, the aging legend facing the new generation, the glorious past against the promising future. However, what most intrigued veteran journalists was the aura of calm and purpose that emanated from Manny, so different from the nervous intensity that normally precedes great confrontations. When questioned about this unusual serenity, Pacquiao responded with an enigmatic smile, mentioning only that he had found a new perspective on the meaning of victory and defeat, a perspective that transcended the immediate result in the ring. Behind the scenes, Manny's technical team also noticed something different in his approach. Freddie Roach, who knew Pacquiao better than any other trainer, commented on how the boxer seemed to have found a new balance between intensity and tranquility, between fierce determination and serene acceptance, a combination that the experienced coach had rarely witnessed in his many years in the sport. During one of the strategy sessions, when discussing Barrios' strengths and weaknesses, Manny surprised his team by talking not about how to defeat the opponent, but about how to honor the sport and his legacy through a performance that demonstrated the values he had always tried to represent: courage, resilience, humility, and respect. During a particularly intense phase of training in mid-May, when many athletes would feel the weight of pressure accumulating, Manny seemed to flourish, demonstrating not just an impressive physical condition for a man of his age, but also a mental clarity that reflected in every aspect of his preparation. In quiet moments between training sessions, he frequently reread the Pope's letters, finding in them not just spiritual comfort, but a constant reminder of how his journey extended far beyond the boxing ring. The reflections shared by the pontiff about how small acts of kindness can reverberate through the years had touched something deep in Manny, helping him reconnect with the fundamental purpose that had initially led him to boxing. not just as a means to escape poverty, but as a way to demonstrate that human dignity can prevail even in the most adverse circumstances. In the last days of May, with the July fight still more than a month away, Pope Leo XIV found himself in a moment of reflection in his private chapel at the Vatican. In the eyes of the few assistants present at his morning Mass, it was just another day of personal devotions in the pontiff's life, but in his heart, there was a special intention guiding his prayers. Without mentioning specific names or circumstances, the Pope offered a homily about how God frequently works through the most unlikely encounters, using the most unexpected instruments to weave the fabric of divine providence. In his reflections, he commented on how it is only decades later that we manage to glimpse the greater purpose behind apparently insignificant moments in our lives. A stranger who crosses our path, a hand extended in a moment of need, a word of encouragement when we need it most. On the other side of the world, in his final training camp in Las Vegas, Manny Pacquiao intensified his preparation for the imminent confrontation with Mario Barrios. The weeks had been following a meticulously established routine: morning runs, exhausting sparring sessions, technical refinement and strategy work, all calibrated to reach peak form exactly at the right moment in July. However, there was something different in this final phase of preparation. On a small improvised table in his room, Manny had created a space for reflection, with all the Pope's letters organized chronologically beside the wooden rosary he had received. Each morning, before starting his physical routine, the boxer dedicated time for silent contemplation, not visualizing victory or glory, but seeking clarity and strength to honor the path that had brought him to this moment in his life. The expectation around the combat grew daily in the world boxing community. Fans from all over the world were already reserving hotels in Las Vegas and buying tickets for what many considered possibly the last great fight in the career of a sports legend. Experts debated incessantly on sports television networks, most predicting a comfortable victory for the younger and stronger Barrios, though always adding the caveat that one should never underestimate the heart and experience of Pacquiao. What none of them could know, however, was how the exchange of letters with the Pope had transformed Manny's perspective on this combat, not as a last desperate effort to prove something to the world, but as an opportunity to demonstrate values that transcended the sport itself. At the Vatican, after concluding his official commitments of the day, the Pope sat down to write what would be his last letter to Manny before the fight. With his careful handwriting, he did not offer technical advice about boxing, obviously, nor did he pressure for a specific result. Instead, his words spoke about how our lives often follow paths we could never predict, and how the most significant moments of our journey are rarely those that receive headlines or applause from the world. "When we briefly met in that chapel in Sinaloa," wrote the pontiff, "we were just two unknown souls sharing a moment of common humanity. Decades later, our lives have followed trajectories that neither of us could imagine. But perhaps the deepest value is not in the positions we occupy, but in fidelity to the principles that have guided us to here." As the final days of preparation unfolded, both the pontiff at the Vatican and the boxer in Las Vegas found themselves reflecting on the extraordinary symmetry of their lives. Both had departed from humble origins to reach positions of immense prominence in their respective fields. Both carried the weight of enormous expectations and constant public scrutiny. Both sought, amid their monumental responsibilities, to keep alive the flame of compassion and authenticity that had initially guided them in their journeys. And now, in ways that neither could have predicted on that distant day in the Mexican chapel, their stories had intertwined again, each serving as inspiration and source of strength for the other. In the last sparring session before entering the rest period that would precede the fight week, Manny Pacquiao demonstrated a quality of movements and reflexes that surprised even his younger sparring partners. Freddie Roach, observing from outside the ring, noticed how the Filipino boxer seemed to have found a rare harmony between physical intensity and mental serenity, a combination that the experienced trainer considered the ideal state for a fighter. At the end of the session, while the bandages were being removed from his hands, Manny silently reflected on the journey that had begun in that Mexican chapel and now led him to this significant moment. The hungry young man from decades ago and the world champion preparing for yet another challenge were the same person, transformed by time, experience, victories and defeats, but still fundamentally shaped by the values of dignity, faith, and perseverance that had sustained his extraordinary trajectory. As July approached, Manny felt a growing sense of peace. Not the complacency of one who underestimates the challenge ahead, but the tranquility of one who understands that the true meaning of his journey transcends any result that the ring might bring. If you like this kind of story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos.